what does the research say about, so now we're talking about the academics. I'm a practitioner, so I smiled when I saw number 1. Because they collect a lot of data, and then when they find something that's really strong, they get really excited about it, right? And they start running around the room, hey, we found something that's really they use the word robust, right? Word I hate. It's really robust finding. What is it? There are no maniacs on the team. Sorry? Yeah, right. They refer to it as emotionally unstable. I will tell you that you will also find on some of those teams narcissistic personality disorders and sociopaths. And they are in large positions of responsibility. So let me just give you a quick lecturette on the difference between narcissistic personality disorders and sociopaths. Because obviously from the look on your faces, you know at least one. A narcissist has no capacity for empathy. It's all about them. It never occurs to them to think about the perspective of another person. They're never wrong. They deflect responsibility. I mean, it goes on and goes on and goes on. I met a guy who had been acquired, his business had been acquired from another company. And it was all about him. And he decided that in order to drive his company to a point where he could sell it, that there were times where he would work 4 or 5 days straight to drive the company forward without sleep. And he ended up in the hospital 6 times from exhaustion. And he looked at me with this smile on his face. And I said, you're proud of that, aren't you? He said, absolutely. It was all about him. And I said, when you were sick, did the organization move ahead? No. It was about him being the center of attention, driving the organization forward. And the funny thing he said when I first met him was, I said, I'm working with the CEO and the COO. We're trying to figure out how the team can work together yet. Do you have any initial thoughts or recommendations before we get into too much details? Any burning issues you want, excuse me, bring up? And he said a very odd thing to me. He said, I'm not sure I like you yet. It's all about him. All right, so narcissists do not have the capacity for empathy. So it doesn't occur to them that when they do something, it has a negative effect on somebody else. They put a lot of people off and they're not even aware of it. That's different than a sociopath. Most sociopaths have very good empathy. They read you very well. They size you up very quickly. But the problem is they don't have ethics. So when I was first out of my clinical program, I worked in a psychiatric hospital, the largest private psychiatric hospital in the country, with 2 locked doors between the patients and the outside world. And what they had in that population were adolescent sociopath males. It's the kind of environment you needed to contain them in until you could figure out how you're going to deal with them. And as one kid very succinctly explained to me, because it occurred to me, I really had never met narcissists and sociopaths, but particularly sociopaths before. How do they think and experience things differently than I do? And I said, when you steal something from somebody, what do you think and feel about? And he says, well, when I take your wallet, I'm not taking your wallet. I'm taking money that I should have. Whew. So when you start thinking about what you read in the Wall Street Journal about Ponzi schemes and other kinds of things that people do, they have a high degree of respect. But somewhere along the way, it didn't matter to them what they were doing to other people, and they were trying to do it to be able to gain advantage for themselves. You probably and may have, I think the estimate that I saw recently from someone who's a researcher and clinician who does this kind of work is it's something like 14% of the population, 16% of the population, is highly likely to be sociopathic. Whew. So that means probably about 2 people in this room might be in that. The other characteristic of highly effective teams is that they're willing to grapple with conflicting points of view without experiencing personal conflict. And that includes clear accountability. People, when they finish the discussion, they can have... my first experience of this years ago was I did some consulting with Canteen Corporation. Dominant white male company, good old boy network. But nobody prepared me for this. I went into the room, and they started talking about operations, and I thought a fist fight was going to break out. And they were yelling at each other and screaming at each other and pointing fingers and you're an asshole and it went on, excuse my French. And it went on for, an hour, and then they landed someplace. And they said, okay, let's go across the street for a beer. They all packed up, and they would put their arms around each other, and they went off and had a drink. And I looked at them like, what happened? I have no idea what happened. So they had their own culture of how they dealt with that, but they didn't personalize the conflict. And they took accountability for things. High-performing teams do that. The team I'm working with right now, the conversation we had on Tuesday was to be fully self-disclosing. Gary, who's the CEO of ConAgra, came from PepsiCo, which has a reputation historically of swimming, bleeding in a pool of sharks. So you always protected yourself, and you never let people know when you were weak, when you didn't know what was going on, etc. And having lived in that environment, he said, if we're going to run a company of this size, you need to tell us when you're not sure and when you don't know. Because then we know what reality is, and we can either help you or we can get you more information, but don't just gloss over and put lipstick on a pig and assume it's going to look nice. So those are the kinds of things that are sort of double clicks on that component of it. They have high trust and high confidence. They know each other really well. They may not always agree with each other, but they trust that the person is working, their intent and what they're working on and how they relate to each other is something that they can trust on. They're predictable. They think of themselves as a part of the team. I had one guy one time, it was really interesting. The CEO said, so there's two components to the story. One is dealing with an introvert, and the other piece is ascending to the C-suite. I had a guy who I was coaching who was an introvert, really smart guy. And he finally got to the senior executive team. And during breaks, he would sit back and read the Wall Street Journal or whatever he was reading, or scientific journals or whatever was in front of him. Everybody else in the room was an extrovert. So they were out in the hallway talking to each other, and and the CEO started wondering, he says, he doesn't seem fully engaged. So I talked him through all of this, and what I discovered was, the CEO didn't understand that introverts need time to internalize and process things. But then they don't speak often, and they don't talk to each other, and that's not how they process information. They do it internally. But when he compares it against his past experiences, his training, and his data banks, and when he does speak, people turn to listen. And that was the question I had to the CEO. When he does speak up, is it really good? And he says, yeah, it can turn the whole vector of the conversation. So I had to train the CEO on how you draw out introverts, because he had a really good guy on the team, but he would have dismissed him as a result of being the introvert. Now, let's talk the other side. It takes two to tango. Talk to the introvert. And I said, what's going on with, you're not really stepping up and being very aggressive in these meetings? And he said, I think I finally figured it out. For years I was in this company, and I was looking up the food chain, and I was saying, I don't know what he or she is smoking on the weekends, but I wouldn't run the company this way. I can't figure out how they're going to make these kinds of decisions. Why would they do that? When I'm king or queen, I'm going to run this company in a different way. He says, I woke up, and I am them. And all of a sudden I realized sometimes we're making decisions with incomplete information, and we're choosing between lesser evils, but we have to choose and move on. And I have to join ranks and go out and present a united front to the employees. This is really hard for me. He hadn't emotionally joined up. So I had to tweak both of those. So the piece of this about thinking about themselves as part of a team is everybody feels like they are on the same team. And after a transition with a CEO or a large GM, when they start changing the team out, my best advice to them is tell the people who are standing there around the table to stop looking over their shoulder. They're not going to be pulled out. This is the team, and they're all in the same lifeboat. And the lifeboat goes down and it sinks, or the lifeboat rows. But either way, this is the team. Let's figure out how we're going to work together. Stop having people second-guessing and covering themselves up. Finally, they're politically capable. We know that there's going to be politics. We already know there's going to be agendas. The question is, they deal with it in reasonable kinds of ways. I can't get you what you want right now, but we're going to get part of that. And in response to that, I'm going to get you what you want. So there's trade-offs, there's things, thinking about the politics, recognizing people's input, giving them credibility for things that you can't do at this point in time without dismissing them. That's how they manage a lot of the politics. And the final key piece to the puzzle, an adaptable leader. When I first started working with Enrique Sosa, the second CEO of Amoco Chemicals, he was the number 2 guy at Dow, didn't get the presidency at Dow, came to take over the presidency at Amoco. The previous president was smart enough that all the commodity prices had lined up, like the planets had lined up once it was going to happen in his lifetime. He contributed $1 billion to the bottom line, and he knew from there it was just going to be downhill. So he smartly left and took on a different role in strategy in the company. So Enrique comes in, And he's not really sure who he's got on his team, and he's not really sure. He manages in an entirely different style. Jim, the previous CEO, managed in a hub and spoke, right? So everything went through Jim. Everything was an individual conversation. And we'll show that in a few minutes. He didn't use a network. Enrique expected the team to talk to each other and use each other as a network. He expected them to wear a second hat, which is a general business manager. I need you not to be just the manager of your business unit. I need you to be also a manager of the entire company. And I need you to speak up as if you own this company. So he wasn't quite sure they were ready to make those kinds of transitions. So I did an upward appraisal piece for him, an upward feedback piece for him. And so he'd been very non-directive in the meetings. He just created, he framed issues, he put them on the table. He waited for people to come forward and see how they were going to react to it. Finally, I did the feedback, and people said, we're ready, let's go, put your foot on the gas, got to go forward. And so I went back to Enrique, and I said, everybody says they're ready. They're ready to move forward. I think you need to shift your style. The next meeting he came in, it was like a different person. He came in and started saying, this is how we're going to frame this. How would you suggest we do this? Let's do that. I mean, it was very involvement-oriented, very defining, and starting to set goals and moving the whole piece forward. And much more directive than he had been in the past, but it was based on conversations that he had. It wasn't just things in his own head. The adaptable leader knows when it's time to shift gears. The adaptable leader knows how to respond in different kinds of ways. Now, David this morning talked about some of this in terms of strategic thinking and other things. What's interesting is if you get those 5 things right, this tends to happen. It's an outcome variable. That's what the researchers tell me. This is not something you necessarily focus on. It's when you have people who trust each other, who are dealing with the business issues, who are very candid with each other, you start asking reasonable business person questions about what are our customers doing? What are our competitors doing? How are we positioned in the marketplace? Is where we are sustainable? What's the barriers to the competition? All that stuff starts to happen as a result of that. You get alignment and agreement because we're talking this stuff out explicitly. We're talking reality, and we're not shading things. How are senior executive teams, C-suite teams, like other high-performing teams? They have a commitment to an overriding goal. They all believe that where we're going and what we're trying to achieve is worthwhile. Everybody wants to be on a winning team. What is it that we're trying to do? They share expectations of conduct. It's what I call, it's my label. How are we going to work together? And anybody in the room, so this is one of the dangers. If the HR person is the person is the only person who gets to raise their hand and say, wait a minute, we just had a conversation, and Charlie, you poked so-and-so. I thought we said we weren't going to do that. You're kind of in a role you may want to get out of. You may want to encourage that anybody in the room watching that kind of behavior gets to raise their hand and say, we need to, wait a minute, this isn't how we decided we were all going to talk to each other and work with each other. So they do have explicit expectations of conduct. Some of them are implicit, but some of them actually have it on the wall. I mean, they actually have the rules of engagement on the wall. And anybody can call timeout for a correction. And they don't let other team members fail. This was a big insight for me when I was on the integration team going from Amoco to BP, and I was sitting in the UK in this meeting room. And Lord Brown was, I mean, this is breathtaking. It was the biggest commercial deal that had been done to date. And we're talking about things like creating $100 billion business units. And I always was amused because Lord Brown, who was just a little guy, was standing up in front going, well, I think we should probably make all the business units about $1 billion because of human scale. Which meant, after you got about $1 billion, most people couldn't manage the business. It's too big, it's too complex. But I'm sitting there going, we're going to create 100 of these things. Holy mackerel. They put them in sectors, which was a whole different, what the heck is a sector? What that meant was if there were 5 or 6 business units there and your business unit was doing well, but somebody else's business unit was struggling, your compensation was based not only on your own business unit, but on the sector was doing. You had huge incentives to say, if my margins are good and I've got some cash to flow and you need cash, I'm going to give it to you. A lot of companies don't work that way. So they do not allow other team members to fail. This can also happen on an interpersonal basis. Somebody pulls somebody over on the side and says, I want to talk to you. I have a CFO right now dealing with a COO rather, and the COO was brought in from the outside. He's been struggling. And the CFO said, I need to have dinner with this guy every time he comes in town. I want to coach him on how to operate himself inside of this culture. So he took it upon himself to do that. A reasonable person's question is, does our C-suite really work as a team? The first question is it really the CEO engaging everybody as a team where everybody has an opportunity to speak up, or are we just holding court for the CEO to talk to everybody individually? Or is it just another layer in the management structure? This is the most visual way I can show it to you. I actually have worked with executives who operate in the way of the right. Everything goes through him or her. Every conversation starts that way. On the flip side, we have organizations where anybody can go to anybody. And a lot of this stuff is happening. And I think this is what David was referring to this morning, is that red person in the middle over there, the organization is dependent upon them. And if they get hit by a beer truck, or it's Steve Jobs, or it's somebody else, the thing starts to fall apart. Over here, what I'm trying to get my leaders to do is architect a business that doesn't require that they're there. It doesn't need you. You will be successful if you can go out and play golf and know that the business is going to be operating. Because you've made a lot, and the most important decisions that these kinds of folks make are people decisions, right? It's the toughest ones. You get the right people with the right competencies, with the right stuff in the right jobs, man, it just sails. You get people who are close, it struggles. They drag the company back. So what is the top executive team? One of the other characteristics that you tend to see, I call it the second hat. It's everybody in the room gets to think about and contribute and comment on the business. It's like you're a mini general manager. I think this is the answer to David's question this morning about how do you get a seat at the table and how do you contribute. You need to be able to have a general manager's point of view. If you don't have it, go get some help from some other people around and find out when they look at the spread, when they look at the financials, when they look at the operation numbers, when they look at the metrics, how do they think about that? How do they do the pattern recognition? You'll pick it up pretty quickly. This is in the skill and knowledge area. This is not about something in terms of DNA that you just come into this on your own. You can learn this very quickly. But what's different about these high-performing teams is anybody gets to raise their hand, including the HR person who says, the thing that you just talked about this marketing strategy and how we're going to go to market and the consumer's response that we heard from the focus group so far, it doesn't add up. I don't know. Call me silly, say I woke up stupid this morning, but it just doesn't hang together. Can you run that one more time? And you're probably not the only person in the room thinking it. But just because it's in marketing doesn't mean you don't get to comment or question it.